He played drums on one of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time, and then he vanished without a trace. His disappearance was so sudden that it left both fans and his former bandmates to reasonably assume that he died. But then, over 3 decades after he vanished, he suddenly reappeared thanks to an obscure connection involving a 19th century furniture designer. All of this before tragically passing away right after re-entering the limelight. Such a story sounds like it's something out of a book, but it's all a true story about one man, John Mayhew. Mayhew's bombastic drumming on Genesis' second studio album Trespass gained him international fame. But his legacy is mad as he joined that list of talented musicians who dropped out of bands right before they hit the dizzying heights of superstardom. Mayhew's name sits alongside drummers like Pete Best and Doug Sandham, men whose early influence saw bands begin to climb the ladder of the music industry before falling off just before they grabbed that final rung and hit the big time. Given how interesting and varied Mayhew's life is, little is known about him, and most people in the know simply reduce him to that guy who was replaced by Phil Collins. Did he play in any bands before he played for Genesis? Did he ever interact with any of his former bandmates after he left? And why is his name totally left out of conversations around the progressive music scene, unlike other ex-Genesis members Anthony Phillips and Steve Hackett? Let's find out as we dig into the definitive story of the most elusive man in the history of this iconic band. The man whose thundering drums on the knife arguably aided Genesis' rise to the top. This is Looking for Someone, the fascinating life of Genesis drummer John Mayhew. Our story begins in Ipswich. Mayhew was born on March the 27th, 1947, and grew up in a house on Macaulay Road, where he lived with his parents and his brother Paul, who was a decade older than he was. When John was a teen, his family life was torn apart as his parents divorced, and he decided to stay with his father while his brother stayed with his mother. When he was 16, John took his first foray into music as he was offered a gig as the drummer for a band started by his school friend Barry. There was just one small problem with this. John Mayhew had never touched a drum kit before. He showed up to the first rehearsal, sat behind the kit, and proceeded to use nothing but his intuition and power to whack the living daylights out of the drums, until one of his bandmates stopped him and kindly explained a simple offbeat drum pattern to him, which he soon got the hang of. John would go on to purchase a cheap Premier drum kit and move to London in the late 1960s, all in the aid of furthering his love of music, which had become his main hobby by this time. He wasn't fussy when it came to music, playing with a wide variety of genres in a wide variety of groups, such as Animal Farm, The Epics, Steam Hammer, and St. Willie's Cool School. It was also around this time that John completed an apprenticeship in carpentry, which he would find coming in handy during his tenure with Genesis. As a semi-professional musician always looking to further his craft, John Mayhew would often leave his name and phone number all over London in the hope that the next big band would stumble across it. And one day, after he returned home from work, his girlfriend told him that someone had phoned about a band and was going to call back at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock rolled around and the phone rang, and on the other end was 19-year-old Mike Rutherford, who spent the phone call trying to convince John to join his band. The name of that band was Genesis. Looking back, one would think this is the greatest phone call a person could possibly receive. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20, and what Mayhew was listening to was a pitch from a band of literal nobodies who had formed in 1967 and had only released one album titled From Genesis to Revelation, with the help of Charterhouse alumni Jonathan King. The album sold a mere estimated 650 copies and was released by a band of semi-professionals who were still yet to play a full gig in front of a live audience. All these points forced a young Mike Rutherford to spend 20 minutes trying to convince John Mayhew to join. Much to his delight, John Mayhew agreed, and with that he would go on to become an integral figure in the early chapters and verses of Genesis. After a brief rehearsal period at the home of guitarist Anthony Phillips, the band would head off to Christmas Cottage in Surrey in October 1969, where they would reside for 6 months to transform themselves from the Bee Gee-esque pop songwriters they were on their first album into the progressive rock titans that they were destined to become under the tenure of lead singer Peter Gabriel. The entrance into Christmas Cottage, which belonged to friend of the band Richard MacPhail's parents, was remembered fondly by John Mayhew, who said, "The cottage was quite a magical place. It was one of the best years of my life. There were no arguments and no clashing egos." Mike Rutherford, however, remembers the time at the cottage very differently, stating in his autobiography The Living Years, "We argued like F in that cottage. It was a mixture of love and hate with probably a bit of murder in there as well." He continues to say, "Someone would always be storming off upstairs or out the front door and we'd have to regroup." So with these two conflicting and very different accounts of their time there, it's hard to really get a full grasp on the truth. But I'd assume it was somewhere between those two statements. So, the band consisting of Mayhew on drums, Peter Gabriel on lead vocals and flute, Tony Banks on keyboards, Anthony Phillips on guitar, and Mike Rutherford on bass and guitar, finally had a place to rehearse and develop their sound. They often practiced for 11 hours a day, and new complex song ideas came out thick and fast. But for all the progress they were able to make, there was just still one piece of the puzzle missing, which was the small issue of them still not having played live. For the live debut of a group who would later sell out stadiums, their first gig was less than glamorous. It was a birthday party for the neighbour of the Gabriel family, Mrs. Barham. They performed at the party in September 1969 for the sum of just £25. It was an awkward experience for all involved, and the reaction was far less than positive. Mayhew remembered, "It was an entirely inappropriate party for a band like Genesis to play. They wanted a regular band, but Genesis wouldn't know how to be a regular band." Undeterred by the somewhat mixed reaction of their first live experience, Peter Gabriel spent hours every single day phoning round trying to get Genesis some real gigs. It was at these first proper gigs that John Mayhew's experience on the road came in handy, as he brought with him a different set of clothes to change into after the gig, something which had never even occurred to the other members of the band. Going into 1970, Genesis would play anywhere that would have them. These gigs were mainly performed to unenthusiastic audiences who were not ready for the band's soft, pastorally tinged brand of music. We rapidly discovered that on a Friday night, people don't really want to listen to Pasadena, remembered John Mayhew. They want to get their rocks off. There was a bit of a strategy change. The songs would have to become much more punchy and rock and rolly, more Friday night-ish. It was during one of these early shows that an unexpected advantage of having Mayhew in the band soon came to the forefront, as his carpentry skills allowed him to put actual seats in the band's van. John also built flute stands, cymbal stands, and even a custom Leslie speaker cabinet for Tony Banks' Hammond organ. Between September 1969 and July 1970, Mayhew played an estimated 87 shows with Genesis. The highlights of Mayhew's gigging time with Genesis were arguably the Atomic Sunrise Festival at London's Roundhouse in 1970, which was actually filmed, a live session for the BBC Radio 2 programme Night Ride, and most crucially, the Marquee Club, where they were spotted by producer John Anthony. Anthony was the one who convinced Tony Stratton-Smith, the owner of Charisma Records, to come and check out Genesis. Smith was instantly enamoured by the unique sound of the group, and he soon signed Genesis to his Charisma label. At the signing session, perhaps the most famous anecdote regarding John Mayhew happened. Tony Stratton-Smith offered the band an allowance of £15 a week to live off, almost £200 adjusted for inflation, to which John Mayhew from his working class background replied, £15 a week? £10 would be just fine. After getting kicked under the table thanks to this little stunt, Genesis would take a huge pay cut, and it was an incident the band were not quick to forget. Aside from the busy calendar of gigs, Charisma Records were now expecting an album. So in June 1970, Genesis entered Trident Studios to cut their only studio album to feature John Mayhew. Along with producer John Anthony, Genesis spent 4 weeks making the album, dedicating 2 weeks to recording and 2 to creating the final mix. Aside from laying down the parts he had meticulously honed for the material on the road on his Ludwig drum kit with his Zildjian cymbals, John Mayhew also contributed backing vocals to several tracks on the album. Of all the songs that Mayhew recorded for this album, The Knife was the one that remained permanently etched in John's memory, with him later recounting, "I remember feeling particularly in the mood to play The Knife that day for some reason. It seemed to go well." Whilst this was an incredibly happy period in the life of John Mayhew, this happiness was not shared by bandmate Anthony Phillips, who decided to leave the band after playing his final show with them on July the 18th, 1970, at the King's Arms in Hayward Heath. Little did John Mayhew know at the time that this was also his last ever show with Genesis. Phillips' departure was one event that the band felt at the time that they may not be able to overcome. At that time, they had survived getting dropped by Decca Records and Jonathan King. They had survived losing 2 drummers, and they had survived playing gigs to an audience of 1. But losing the driving force pushing them to go professional and play live was a hurdle they felt they may not be able to overcome. Peter Gabriel and Mike Rutherford eventually warmed up to the idea of carrying on, but Tony Banks was unsure and issued an ultimatum with the band. In the 1974 interview to promote Selling England by the Pound, Tony was asked about John Mayhew and the departure of Anthony Phillips and said, "Well, I was going to leave as well, but I said to Mike and Pete that I'd stay on if we got rid of John Mayhew and tried to start again with a rather better drummer and better band." There had in fact been dissent in the ranks regarding Mayhew's drumming since around the time he joined the band. Going back to Rutherford's autobiography, he said that the problem with John Mayhew was that he was possibly better at carpentry than drumming, claiming that Pete would often have to show John how his part would go, which was pretty frustrating for the both of them. Producer John Anthony was also very critical of Mayhew's drumming on Trespass, saying that he couldn't really drum. He wasn't giving the band time, he was following their time. It was like a beautiful work without the necessary foundation, and this was felt very much. Mayhew's working class background has also been a point of contention with the 4 Charterhouse lads, with Tony Banks commenting, "It was quite difficult for John, I think, because we had all been to public school and behaved a certain way, which must have been very irritating for him." And so a meeting was set up in a coffee shop in London, and little did he know that shortly after recording The Knife, John Mayhew was about to be given the chop by Genesis. It was Peter Gabriel who was given the unfortunate task of dismissing him, and as Mayhew remembers it, the conversation began with Gabriel simply asking him, "How would you feel about leaving?" So, with tears in his eyes, John Mayhew had to face the reality that his time with the band he had given almost a year of his life to was now over. All he could say was, "Sure." Mayhew himself was also aware that his technical ability was not quite up to scratch with the rest of the band, reflecting that, "For me, I was finding it difficult to pull out innovation and creativity. I suppose I should have this glorious history of recording and gigging, but I really was just this guy from the suburbs or nowhere almost. I just somehow managed to land that gig. I did the best I could out of it, and lots of people liked it. I could see they were going places I probably wasn't destined to go. It wasn't an acrimonious parting or anything of that sort. It was quite sad. I felt quite sad." Mayhew was dismissed from Genesis 3 months before the album Trespass was eventually released, and the band went on to recruit Phil Collins, Mick Barnard, and then eventually Steve Hackett. But while the band continued moving towards greatness, Mayhew simply disappeared. For over 30 years, nobody knew of Mayhew's whereabouts. He was noticeably absent from a major reunion in 1998 to promote the release of the Archive 1 box set, featuring every single past member of Genesis. It was only in 2006 that a man named Dave Burgess was teaching a course on how to construct furniture by Charles René Mackintosh that the world got their first lead as to where Mayhew was. You see, Burgess was a huge Genesis fan, and while he was checking the list of names of attendees on the course, one name in particular stood out to him. While he initially thought it was a fairly common name and it was all just a coincidence, the possibility that it was more than just a coincidence took hold. This all came to a head when a conversation about music among those taking the course led one of them to admitting that he used to play the drums. Dave's jaw dropped as he suddenly realised that he was indeed right about the name on the attendees list. As the story goes, he exclaimed, "No!" as he realised that he had found the elusive former Genesis drummer John Mayhew. But his reappearance raised one massive question. Just where the hell had John Mayhew been for the last 30 years? Much of this period of John Mayhew's life is still very much shrouded in mystery, but from the few interviews he gave, we can construct a rough timeline of the time he spent away from the public eye. Soon after his dismissal from Genesis, John made the decision to return to Ipswich and resumed his life as a carpenter while playing drums for fun in a local group. Surprisingly, John and a friend went to Essex University in order to watch Genesis on October the 23rd, 1971. John even hung out with the band after the gig, which is where he first met Phil Collins and Steve Hackett. Collins and Mayhew discussed spare parts for Collins' drums, and he would then go on to discuss carpentry and share a few beers with Steve Hackett. From here, John Mayhew would end up in Germany. Whilst there, he performed in a band that used to tour the American air bases around the country, before ending up in Norway in 1979. Whilst there, Mayhew met his second wife, and together they moved to New Zealand, where John continued drumming just as a hobby. After a messy divorce in 1982, John moved to Australia and gained citizenship. But not long after a particularly grueling and sweaty gig, Mayhew decided that it was time for him to hang up his drumsticks for good. Within 2 weeks of quitting the instrument that had been at the centre of his heart for so long, he had sold his drums and decided to get himself a college diploma in set design and scenic art. Aside from creating sets for TV and film in Australia, John also made 16th and 17th century style French furniture, whilst exploring other avenues of his creativity. Whilst John was toiling away across workshops in the Southern Hemisphere, his old bandmates were enjoying massive commercial success across the globe. His replacement, Phil Collins, was always blaring out of radios and supermarkets, constantly reminding Mayhew of his brief stint in Genesis and the success that he narrowly missed out on when Peter Gabriel asked him to leave. Curiously enough, John ended up going to see Phil Collins perform live in Perth on April the 20th, 1985. There must have certainly been a weird atmosphere in the air tonight when John Mayhew saw Phil Collins. Almost a whole year later, John's mother Alice, who was 73 years old at the time, issued a plea to the papers, saying, "I sometimes wonder if he is still alive. I hope against hope I will see him again." A reporter for the Daily Mirror ended up tracking John down in Fremantle, Australia, where he had been living on a remote beach. He told the Mirror that he was the happiest he'd ever been in his whole life, and to tell his mother that he was okay. The Mirror then ran a piece about John on February the 17th, 1986, which seemed to somewhat slip under the radar of Genesis fans at the time. It was a full 3 years later that John Mayhew finally returned to the UK. He came back with the intention of visiting his mother, who was unwell at the time. During his brief trip, he was interviewed by the Sunday People magazine about his time as the drummer in Genesis. Shortly after this, John returned to Australia and lived in a rented flat with 4 other people. In the next 15 years, seemingly no one heard from John Mayhew until he was accidentally discovered in the aforementioned Dave Burgess incident of 2006. Burgess told Mayhew about a Genesis convention that was taking place at the London Astoria on Saturday the 27th of May, and suggested that he should attend. Burgess also contacted Genesis management and informed them that he had indeed located the elusive Mr. Mayhew, but more on that later. Mayhew attended the convention and was delighted to be reunited with former bandmate Anthony Phillips, who he had not seen for around 36 years at this point. It was upon reuniting with Phillips that Mayhew finally got some closure about his time in Genesis, saying, "I was carrying around this thought that I had held the band back because I wasn't technically good enough. When I said that to Anthony Phillips, he said I hadn't held Genesis back, that I wasn't responsible for the creative flow being lost. For 36 years I had carried around that load, and it had become part of my personality. And I'm still coming to terms with it. It's been a long time to carry around the idea that you somehow failed." But they didn't see it as a failure. At the end of the convention's first day, Mayhew was drinking in a hotel bar and talking with the Genesis tribute band Regenesis. After a few drinks, they asked Mayhew how he would feel about joining them on stage the next day to perform The Knife. Considering John had not played the song in 36 years and hadn't listened to it in several decades, he was understandably nervous of the prospect of doing it again in front of a full crowd. The drinks came steadily, and the conversation kept flowing, and before the end of the night, Mayhew had reluctantly agreed to perform the song with the band. The next day came around, and as soon as Mayhew took to the stage, the fans began cheering and shouting, In fact, it got so loud that the cheering drowned out the music, as well as all the doubts that had been spread over the years about Mayhew's abilities as a drummer. He later admitted that he just fluffed and flaffled his way through it. But the crowd still loved what they saw, acknowledging that it was more important ensuring that it was John's bum sat on the drum seat, more than knowing what he was actually playing. The convention was a huge high for Mayhew, and through it he was thrust once again into the spotlight. He gave several interviews to Genesis fan sites and attended other conventions throughout Europe. The icing on the cake, however, was John's royalty check that he received for his work on Trespass. He had not received a single penny up until that point, but suddenly he received a whopping £78,000 check for the royalties from that album alone. To put that into perspective, that is around £130,000 adjusted for inflation. The world was now John Mayhew's oyster. And when asked about his future plans at another Genesis convention, he said that he was planning to return to Australia and buy a picturesque house in Sydney, with the view of building and starting his own workshop there, and that the money he had received was now his well-earned retirement. The years came and went, and once again John Mayhew vanished from the public eye. This was until March 2009, as Mayhew's older brother Paul mounted a search for him, even though he had not maintained much contact with him since John's visit to the country to see their sick mother. Paul mounted a plea with the Ipswich Star, asking anyone for information about the whereabouts of his brother, pointing out that his tenure in Genesis was a huge source of pride for his family. A few days later, Paul received an email from someone who knew where his brother was. The news, however, was far from happy, as John Mayhew had tragically passed away just 2 days after Paul had put out the initial plea in the Ipswich Star. It came to light that during the last 4 years of his life, John had lived in a run-down flat in Govan, Scotland. During 2007, when Genesis were on their Turn It On Again reunion tour, several newspapers sought out Mayhew with all the renewed interest in the group. But what they found was not pretty. On February the 17th, 2007, the Daily Record published an article with the headline, "Exclusive, Dingy Lifestyle of a Dropout Rocker." The article alleged that Mayhew's rundown flat was a seedy den of substance abuse, one full of so-called friends who found out about Mayhew's royalty check and decided to take full advantage of his generosity. One of Mayhew's friends even attempted to sell the paper a photo of John abusing illegal substances. The article further alleged that Mayhew was spending away his money at uncontrollable rates, claiming that the rapidly dwindling £78,000 was being recklessly spent on illegal substances and alcohol. Mayhew himself even confessed that the place was a 24-hour party den filled with various hangers-on, confirming many of the media's speculations. This tragic spiral into substance abuse soon caught up with him, and he passed away on March the 26th, 2009, when he was 61 years old. Upon learning of his brother's death, Paul released a statement. "My brother passed away last week, just a day before his birthday. He was an alcoholic and had heart problems." News of Mayhew's death soon reached the members of Genesis, as well as the fans, who were all sad to learn of the death of such a major part in the history of such an important band. Anthony Phillips wrote on his website, "Gentle John, so kind and eager to please. Thank you for all your too brief friendship and compassionate concern. Lay all your troubles to rest now. Dream on in peace and drum on with celestial impunity till eternity. Ant." Tony Banks said of John Mayhew, "His time with the group was short, but it was a very crucial period, and his contribution was very important. How we must have appeared to him, I hate to think. He was a very solid drummer, but not really a writer, which was why we decided that if we were to continue after Ant left, we had to find a more creative drummer. A hard decision, because by this time, John Mayhew had become a friend." Steve Hackett also left a touching tribute to John Mayhew on his website, saying, "It seems as if the Book of Genesis has all of a sudden become a slimmer volume. Let's raise a glass to him and have a fresh listen to Trespass. I know I will. My thoughts and love to his family and friends." So, were Genesis right to replace John Mayhew? And why, despite him occasionally appearing in the newspapers, were they unable to locate him over the years? Well, we may never truly know. Mayhew himself acknowledged that he simply wasn't as technical a drummer as Phil Collins, but that he would have enjoyed the mega success, admitting he likely would have also grown weary of being in the same band for so long. The fact is though, when he joined Genesis, John was the most accomplished member of the band, simply because he had years of experience playing live at that point and had played several different styles of music. Despite the flack that his drumming gets, I want you to put yourself in his shoes for a second. In late 1969, when he joined the band, progressive rock was in its infancy. There was no roadmap to follow in terms of parts to play. Imagine that your only knowledge of music is playing covers of songs by the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. And then suddenly you are presented with a song like Stagnation, with multiple time and tempo changes throughout the near 9-minute runtime. Who could he look to in terms of finding inspiration? Or for that matter, any music that was remotely similar to what he was expected to perform? Because his life is still shrouded in much mystery, there are many contradictions in the long and tangled life of John Mayhew. In some interviews his royalty check is claimed to be £72,000, and then in others it's claimed to be £70,000. And in some accounts Mayhew got all his Genesis royalties thanks to Anthony Phillips passing on his details to Mike Rutherford. All the quotes credited to John Mayhew in this video came from transcripts of interviews he gave both to Genesis conventions and fan sites towards the end of his tragically short life. Despite his tragic final years and rough life, John Mayhew deserves to be remembered as one of the pioneers of progressive rock. His distinctive, laid-back drumming style helped to form the groundwork that would enable Genesis to sell over 100 million albums over their illustrious 50-year career. Thank you all for watching.